Judge shames defendant in court, then learns he's her estranged brother. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 12 swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd as Judge Olivia Carter strode in, her black robe billowing behind her. Her piercing brown eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on the defendant standing at the podium. The man before her, scruffy and disheveled in a wrinkled suit, met her gaze with an unreadable expression. Something about him nagged at the back of her mind, but she pushed the thought aside. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as Olivia took her seat at the high bench, her presence commanding. She glanced at the case file before her, Marcus Evans, charged with contempt of court, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. Just another name, another case, another person standing before her awaiting judgment. "Mr. Evans," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "You have been charged with multiple offenses. Do you understand the charges against you?" The man gave a sardonic smile, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "Oh, I understand, Your Honor. More than you think." His voice held a faint tremor, but there was something else, a familiarity she couldn't place. Olivia's brow furrowed. Something about his voice sent a chill down her spine. She pushed forward, ignoring the small, unsettling feeling creeping into her stomach. "The court is not a place for theatrics, Mr. Evans. I suggest you take these proceedings seriously." Marcus chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Oh, I'm taking this very seriously, Olivia." A murmur swept through the courtroom at his informal use of the judge's first name. The bailiff stepped forward, prepared to intervene, but Olivia raised a hand, signaling restraint. "I don't believe we've met before," she said, her voice measured. Marcus' smirk faded, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something raw. "Maybe not in this setting," he said quietly. "But we have met. A long time ago." Olivia stiffened. Her fingers gripped the gavel a little tighter. There was something eerily familiar about the man before her. The tilt of his head, the curve of his jawline, the way his voice carried an unspoken weight. "Explain yourself," she demanded, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Marcus took a deep breath and met her gaze head-on. "I'm your brother." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Olivia felt the world tilt for a moment, the polished wood of the bench suddenly unfamiliar beneath her fingertips. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her estranged brother stood before her, accused, judged, and waiting. And she had no idea what to do next. The gavel's echo still rang in Olivia's ears long after the courtroom fell silent. She struggled to keep her expression composed, to maintain the impartiality demanded of her position. But inside, a storm was brewing. Marcus Evans. Her brother. The brother she hadn't seen in over 20 years. The name had faded from her memory, but now, standing before her in the harsh light of the courtroom, it came rushing back in fragments, a childhood spent in foster homes, whispered promises to stick together, and the day they were finally torn apart. "Your Honor," the bailiff asked hesitantly, breaking Olivia's trance. She cleared her throat, shifting in her seat. "Proceed," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise Holloway, stood and smoothed her navy suit. "The state presents evidence of the defendant's repeated violations of the law, including resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. The police report states that Mr. Evans engaged in an altercation with an officer outside a convenience store, where he was found intoxicated and aggressive." Olivia stole a glance at Marcus. He didn't flinch. He simply folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. Denise continued, "Given his prior record and clear disregard for the law, we request the maximum penalty." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Olivia clenched her fists beneath the bench. Prior record? She hadn't known. What had Marcus been through since they were separated? The defense attorney, a weary-looking man named Thomas Reed, pushed himself up from his seat. "Your Honor, my client has had a difficult past. He's been homeless for years and was unfairly targeted by law enforcement." He cast a glance at Marcus as if weighing his next words. But more importantly, I believe there are extenuating circumstances that should be considered before passing judgment. Olivia's breath caught. Extenuating circumstances. The phrase took on a heavier meaning at this moment. Marcus finally spoke, his voice softer this time. Your Honor, I didn't come here looking for trouble. He hesitated. I was just looking for someone. Someone I lost a long time ago. Olivia's grip on the bench tightened. The courtroom was watching, waiting for her response. The past she had buried was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. She inhaled sharply. Court will reconvene after a recess, she declared, striking the gavel harder than necessary. She stood and exited the chamber, her heart pounding. Outside, she leaned against the marble wall of the hallway, pressing a hand to her forehead. What had started as just another case had turned into something far more personal. And for the first time in her career, Olivia Carter had no idea how to proceed. Olivia had spent years mastering the art of control, of compartmentalizing emotions to uphold the law without bias. But as she stood outside the courtroom, her heart hammering against her ribs, she felt those carefully built walls cracking. The past she had worked so hard to bury was standing on trial before her, a living, breathing reminder of everything she had lost. Marcus wasn't just another case, he was a ghost from her childhood, and now, she had the power to decide his fate. The door to her chambers creaked open, and Denise Holloway stepped inside. Your Honor, she began, her voice cautious, we need to discuss the case before we reconvene. Olivia straightened, forcing herself into the practiced role of impartiality. What is there to discuss? She asked coolly, even as her pulse quickened. Denise studied her for a long moment before setting down a thick file. Your Honor, Marcus Evans has a record, petty theft, vagrancy, resisting arrest. But nothing violent. Nothing that justifies the severity of the charges the prosecution is pursuing. Olivia's lips parted, but she said nothing. It was one thing to see Marcus as a defendant, but another to see his past laid out in stark legal documents. A life that had unraveled while hers had climbed toward prestige. The arresting officer, Denise continued, is pushing for an example to be made out of him. Your brother was caught on camera in a scuffle with law enforcement, and the officer involved is determined to see him behind bars for as long as possible. Olivia's spine stiffened. So the system has already decided his guilt. Denise hesitated. That's the thing. The footage doesn't tell the whole story. He was cornered in an alley. The officer claims Marcus resisted, but from what I saw, he was just trying to get away. A sharp knock at the door cut through the tension. Thomas Reed, Marcus's defense attorney, stepped in. Judge Carter, I need to speak with you. Denise arched an eyebrow. We're in the middle of discussing the case. Thomas exhaled heavily. I just spoke to Marcus. He wants to plead guilty. The words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut. What? He thinks fighting is useless, Thomas said, rubbing his temples. He's been through this before, and he doesn't believe he'll get justice, especially not in this courtroom. Olivia's hands curled into fists. He doesn't think I'll be fair. Thomas hesitated before responding. No, Your Honor. He doesn't think the system will. A tense silence filled the room. Olivia swallowed against the bitterness rising in her throat. She had fought for years to earn her place in the judicial system, believing in its ability to deliver justice. But now, with Marcus before her, she saw the cracks that had always been there, cracks he had fallen through. Denise shifted, glancing at Olivia. If he pleads guilty, the officer's recommendation will stand. He'll be sentenced to at least 5 years. 5 years. Olivia clenched her jaw. The law demanded impartiality, but her conscience screamed otherwise. Could she truly claim fairness if she allowed this to happen? Her fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. No, she said finally. We're not taking the plea just yet. Thomas and Denise exchanged glances, but Olivia was already moving toward the door, her mind racing. When she stepped back into the courtroom, Marcus was standing at the podium again, his eyes hooded with exhaustion. He wouldn't meet her gaze. She took her seat, inhaled sharply, and lifted the gavel. "Court is back in session," she declared. And in that moment, Olivia Carter made a silent promise: she would not let the system consume her brother the way it had so many others. Not without a fight. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Olivia Carter took her seat once more. The weight of her robe felt unbearable, its fabric a reminder of the power she held and the obligation it carried. The gavel trembled slightly in her grip before she brought it down with a sharp crack. "Court is back in session." Marcus Evans stood at the podium, his posture weary but defiant. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable as he met Olivia's gaze. He was no longer the brash man who had mocked the courtroom proceedings earlier. He was a man resigned to his fate, yet unwilling to show fear. The prosecution was ready to proceed, and Denise Holloway, always meticulous, stood with her notes arranged perfectly in front of her. "Your Honor, the state has presented ample evidence that the defendant resisted arrest, incited a public disturbance, and displayed repeated disregard for law enforcement. Given his prior record, we strongly recommend the maximum sentence." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Olivia could feel the eyes of the public weighing upon her, expecting the impartiality she had built her career on. But how could she be impartial when her flesh and blood stood before her? Marcus' defense attorney, Thomas Reed, stood with a controlled breath. "Your Honor, my client was not the aggressor in this case. The footage shows an altercation, yes, but not a clear act of defiance. What it does show is a man cornered, fearful, and reacting in self-preservation." Denise scoffed, flipping a page in her notes. "The law doesn't make exceptions for fear." Thomas didn't back down. "No, but it should recognize when fear is justified." Olivia tapped her fingers against the bench, her thoughts a tempest of reason and personal anguish. "Mr. Evans, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Marcus lifted his head, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Nothing I say will change anything. The system's made up its mind about people like me." Something in Olivia cracked. A memory surfaced, two children, huddled in the dark of a foster home, whispering promises to never let the world break them apart. Promises that had crumbled under the weight of reality. She exhaled. "I disagree, Mr. Evans." A hushed silence settled over the courtroom. Marcus looked at her fully now, confusion flickering behind his hardened expression. "I have reviewed the footage and the reports," Olivia continued, her voice steady. "And while the state argues resistance, I see an unjust escalation. I see a man reacting out of fear, not aggression. I see law enforcement failing to de-escalate a situation they should have controlled." Denise's lips parted slightly, but she remained silent. Olivia pressed on. "Justice is not about blind punishment. It is about ensuring the law serves all equally. Marcus Evans is not without fault, but neither is the system that put him here." The words hung in the air, heavier than the wooden gavel she now gripped. "With that in mind, I am modifying the sentencing recommendation." A shocked murmur spread through the courtroom. "Instead of the maximum penalty, Mr. Evans will enter a supervised rehabilitation and community service program. He will be assigned to legal reform advocacy work under strict monitoring. If he violates the terms, he will face immediate incarceration." Gasps erupted. Thomas nodded in relief. Marcus, for the first time, looked truly stunned. Denise straightened. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. My ruling is final." Olivia's voice was unwavering. Marcus blinked, then let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You think that'll fix anything?" "No," Olivia admitted. "But it's a start." Marcus shook his head, his expression unreadable. But Olivia could see it, the glimmer of something neither of them had dared to acknowledge in years. Hope. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind only the echoes of murmured disbelief and quiet conversations. Olivia remained seated on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, staring down at the empty podium where Marcus had stood just moments before. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, but for the first time in a long time, she felt lighter. Denise Holloway approached hesitantly, her file still clutched tightly in one hand. "You're going to catch a lot of heat for this ruling," she said, her tone a mixture of respect and warning. Olivia exhaled, a small smirk touching her lips. "I know." Denise studied her for a moment before nodding. "But you did the right thing. And that's rare." With that, she turned and exited the room, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts. She finally stood and walked toward her chambers, but just as she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. "Olivia." She turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, still looking as though he hadn't fully processed what had happened. His eyes searched hers, looking for an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. "You think this will change anything?" he finally asked, his voice uncertain. She took a slow breath before responding. "It's a step. Maybe a small one, but it's something." Marcus exhaled a chuckle, shaking his head. "Never thought you'd be the one helping me." Olivia crossed her arms. "Never thought I'd see you in a courtroom like this." A silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken words. Finally, Marcus nodded. "Guess I better not waste the chance you gave me." She nodded back, her throat tight. "Guess not." Marcus hesitated before stepping forward. For a fleeting moment, she thought he might reach for a handshake or even an embrace, but instead, he just held her gaze. Then, with a final nod, he turned and walked away. Olivia watched him go, her chest aching with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The road ahead would not be easy, for him or her. But as she finally stepped into her chambers and closed the door behind her, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the past could be rewritten. Not erased. Not forgotten. But changed. And that was enough to start with. The city skyline stretched beyond the courthouse steps, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. Olivia Carter stood at the entrance, her robe draped over her arm, watching as people filtered out, their conversations carrying remnants of the landmark decision she had made that morning. She had expected backlash. She had expected scrutiny. But as she stood there, breathing in the crisp evening air, she realized that she had also sparked something else, hope. A few feet away, Marcus Evans leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets, watching the crowd disperse. He looked different, not just because of the fresh clothes or the absence of tension in his shoulders, but because, for the first time in years, his future wasn't defined by what had been taken from him. "You're still here," Olivia said, stepping closer. Marcus smirked. "Guess I wanted to see if you'd change your mind last minute." She shook her head, a small chuckle escaping her lips. "Not a chance." A pause settled between them before Marcus spoke again. "I don't know what happens next, Liv. For me. For any of this." Olivia nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "None of us do. But we get to decide what we do with the second chances we're given." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I won't waste it." She reached out, squeezing his shoulder lightly. "Good." As Marcus stepped off into the fading light, Olivia remained standing there, letting the gravity of everything settle. The system wasn't perfect. Change wouldn't happen overnight. But today, in that courtroom, she had taken a step toward something better. And sometimes, that was all it took to start a revolution. As she turned to leave, her gaze flickered to the courthouse, the very place where justice had failed so many, and where she had chosen to fight for something greater. The weight of her decision would follow her for years to come, but in that moment, she carried it with pride. Because justice wasn't just about the law. It was about the people it served.